Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tales from the Vault with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, a joint cooperation between the ALPLM and the Illinois State Museum. We'll get to our topic in just a moment, but just a reminder of a couple of programs upcoming. We have author Matthew Algeo coming here next Friday night to Union Theater to talk about his book, Abe and Fido, Lincoln's Love of Animals and the Touching Story of His Favorite Canine Companion. That'll be coming up next Friday night at 7 o'clock across the street in the theater. And then that following Saturday morning on the 13th, we have a special event. If you've got some furry friends, bring them out to Union Square Park across the street between 10 until 1 on the 13th. We'll be doing Bark in the Park with Abe. We'll have Mr. Lincoln on hand to take pictures with your furry friends. And we encourage folks for both events, whether you're coming out for the talk with the author or the Bark in the Park the next morning, to check our website in advance for the link to see how you can collect some items that are needed by the Animal Protective League here in Springfield. We'll be collecting donations at both of those events. We also have our ongoing questionnaires exhibit across the street in the museum. That runs through May 5th, and coming up on April 20th, we have a $1 Kids Day, so bring the kiddos out, 5 to 12, get in for just $1. It's a fun exhibit. We'll have some special activities going on with that. Check our website, presidentlincoln.illinois.gov, for details on all of those items. Of course, we have our community partnership with downtown Springfield for the Winter Farmers Market tomorrow from 8 to noon, and the final one also coming up on the 20th from 8 to noon in Union Station across the street. And in Union Park that day on the 20th, we'll be providing space for the City of Springfield's Earth Awareness Fair. So a lot of fun coming up this month to the ALPLM. Now, for those of you watching on Facebook and here in person, you're set for a great program from Dr. Ian Hunt, our Chief of Acquisitions. After the presentation, we'll have a chance for you to come up and see the items up close and personal. And whether you're here in person or on Facebook, we'll have a chance to ask some questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, to talk about the crisis of Fort Sumter leading up to the start of the Civil War, we present Dr. Ian Hunt in today's Tales from the Vault.
Well, I guess at this point I can say good afternoon instead of good morning. I want to thank you all for venturing out on what is not as terrible a day as it was yesterday, but what is certainly not ideal for this time of year. It should definitely be warmer. So my greatest, deepest thanks for you guys coming out in this weather. We are a week away from what will be the, I believe, 163rd anniversary of the attack on Fort Sumter. It will be on April the 12th. This is April the 5th, I do believe. Somebody else will have to check my math. I married an accountant for a reason. I am not good at math. But anyway, we thought that with the anniversary of the battle coming up, it would be a great opportunity to talk about Fort Sumter, talk a little bit about the history behind Fort Sumter, why was it constructed, talk about the battle itself a little bit, of course, the famous one where Major Robert Anderson and his men were under siege for roughly 2 days. But then we're also going to talk a little bit about what happens to Sumter after the famous battle in April of 1861. Everyone kind of tends to forget about it after that. It has its one kind of moment in the spotlight, and then it drifts away into obscurity. So why don't we begin by talking a little bit about why Fort Sumter was built in the first place. So in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, U.S. military policy dictated that probably the biggest threat that we were ever going to face as a nation was going to be a European naval seaborne invasion. They didn't really consider whether our own people might turn against us. It was always thought that the European power, whether it be Great Britain, whether it be France, whether it be Spain, or any of the other great seafaring nations of Europe, they were probably going to be what was going to be attacked. So it was decided, especially after the War of 1812, that all of the major harbor fortifications should be strengthened. There were still forts that had been left over from when we were one of the colonies. They were often in poor disrepair. There were forts that were left over from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. They had not been well cared for. And it was just kind of a hodgepodge. So the US military set about constructing a series of forts that would run all up and down, not only the eastern seaboard, but would run through the Florida Keys, all through the Gulf of Mexico, and it would keep America safe from this naval seaborne invasion. So when you come to Fort Sumter, it's actually named for Thomas Sumter, who was a Revolutionary War general. I was telling the early arrivals here that I actually learned something this morning. General Sumter became known as the Carolina Gamecock because of his tenacity in battle, because of his ferocious tactics of constantly attacking his enemies. I'm assuming that that's probably where the University of South Carolina got its mascot from. Today, I don't think we tend to think of the gamecock as an especially ferocious animal, but they clearly were looking to their historical past when they were choosing who they were going to rally behind. So the first mention of what will become Fort Sumter actually appears in a congressional report in early 1826. They had been looking at all of the various places that they thought that a fort needed to be constructed. They weren't really concerned about small rivers and estuaries. They were mostly concerned with the deep water harbors. They were looking at places like Savannah, Georgia. They were looking at places like Norfolk, Virginia. They were looking at places like the Chesapeake Bay, so on and so forth, of where these types of forts should be constructed. And they, of course, looked at Charleston. They knew that it was potential for an attack. The British had attacked it during the Revolutionary War, and they were going to make sure that was not going to happen again. By 1828, the U.S. military had begun to design plans for what they thought Sumter would look like. They construct it atop of a shoal, a sandbar essentially, in Charleston Harbor. And the idea was that it was going to command the entire harbor. The problem they run into is that not only do sandbars shift constantly, so they had to bring in over 70,000 tons of granite to build a man-made island in Charleston Harbor so that the shoal would not shift on them. But then, like any other governmental project, people began to sue. Various people began to sue, claiming that they actually owned the sandbar that the fort was being constructed on, and it ended up going into litigation for a number of years before work was finally resumed back in 1830. The lawsuit begins in 34 and it does not resume until 1841. Work on the fort is incredibly slow. It was intended to be a 5-sided fort. It was going to have a double tier of artillery positions. Only 4 of the walls were actually going to have gun emplacements. The 5th wall was actually going to be reserved for the officers' quarters and the barracks for the enlisted men. So basically the wall that was kind of pointed towards Charleston was not intended to have any kind of heavy artillery emplacements there. But the other 4 walls going out in different directions were intended to defend the city. Because it's on a man-made island, and because the federal government had a lot of other things that they were spending money on this time, work progresses at what today we would call a glacial pace. By December of 1860, the fort is still not completed. Most of the walls have been built, but of the 150 planned artillery positions, or 135 planned artillery positions, only 15 of them had actually been put in place. In fact, in December of 1860, the fort had no military complement of any kind. It had 5, what today we would call general contractors, who were working inside the fort at the behest of the United States government. So that was literally all that was standing between the South Carolinians deciding to simply seize the fort or the US military being able to retain it. So a little thing, unfortunately, called secession comes to South Carolina. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, South Carolina, along with a number of other southern states, decide simply that they cannot live under a Republican administration. December the 20th, the South Carolina Secession Convention met. Its delegates, who were mostly made up of legislators, voted unanimously to repeal the United States Constitution and sever their ties with the Union. You have here the famous Charleston Mercury Union is dissolved broadside. These are incredibly rare today because, first of all, they were never intended to be saved. These were printed up and passed out to various individuals as an easier way to spread news. They were nailed up on the sides of buildings, things of that nature, and it was fully expected that the first time a rainstorm came along, that they would be lost. So today, original Charleston Mercury Union is dissolved broadsides are incredibly rare. The Mercury, which was the fire eater newspaper in Charleston, was so excited about this, they actually have a typo where they put a period between 1 and 15 o'clock instead of a colon. They didn't seem to care. They were so happy that this had passed and that South Carolina was now free of the chains of a Republican administration. They were free of the tyranny that the United States government was going to implement against them, that they put this out anyway. This one is a little bit different. This broadside in general is a little bit different also in the fact that Charleston Mercury was very proud and wanted to make sure the entire world knew what had happened. So they actually mailed copies of this to all of the governors of all of the states, both in the South and the North. They mailed copies of this to Washington, D.C. to let the federal authorities know that the South Carolina was now free and was an independent nation. It has always been rumored that they even mailed one to Abraham Lincoln. Now, this is not Abraham Lincoln's copy, although maybe here I could tell you it is, I don't know. In seriousness, it is not Lincoln's personal copy. It was probably thrown away. If it even arrived in the first place at all, it was probably thrown away by Lincoln's secretaries. I told the early arriving guests that instead of walking around like we traditionally do with these objects, we're going to have them up on the big board, and then we're going to welcome all you guys to come up and see them. So if any of you are like, why isn't he walking it around? That's why. So I'm going to go ahead and just cover this up for right now. So knowing that the situation in Charleston was becoming untenable, Robert Anderson, who is the senior commanding military officer in Charleston, he is a major in the U.S. Army. He is a graduate of West Point. He has served since the Black Hawk War. He actually met Abraham Lincoln during the Black Hawk War briefly. He helped muster in those units into federal service. Anderson knows that the forts that his men currently occupy, which included Castle Pinckney, Fort Johnston, Fort Moultrie, were essentially sitting ducks. They had not been maintained by the federal government for the most part. At Fort Moultrie especially, urban sprawl, as we would call it today, had actually built up around the fort, and there were houses that had been built right in vicinity of Fort Moultrie's walls that were taller than the walls of the fort. And Anderson pointed out that all the South Carolinians would have to do is go to the upper windows of these houses, and they would be able to shoot down on his men and kill them without warning. So, without getting approval from the authorities in Washington, D.C., who, by the way, would have told him absolutely not to this, Anderson consolidates all of his men who were spread out amongst all of these installations, takes them in the evening of December the 26th to Fort Sumter, lands all of them in Fort Sumter, and does his best to destroy as many of the guns in the forts that he had abandoned as possible. So this is actually a quote from the diary of Edmund Ruffin, who was one of the leading secessionists of his era. He was absolutely a fire eater, and he is often credited with being the first one to actually fire on Fort Sumter. He fired the initial round. He yanked the lanyard of the 10-inch mortar round and launched the attack. Ruffin described that he had heard 2 loud discharges of cannons from that fort in quick succession. I suppose this firing at so unusual an hour must have been a signal for something. It was. Anderson was telling all of the men at all of the various forts, now is the time. Immediately head to Fort Sumter, do what you can to disable the forts that you are currently leaving, and we will all meet at Sumter and we will defend it from there. So, for the Lincoln administration that is going to come into power, of course, in March of 1861, I guess I should back up for just a minute and mention that even though Lincoln, of course, is elected president in November of 1860, he does not assume the mantle of authority until March of 1861. There is a 4-month period of time where President James Buchanan is in charge. And Buchanan is frantic. Buchanan is hoping that this situation will either blow over on its own or that it will at least be delayed until he can leave office. In fact, he had made gentlemen's agreements with a number of the South Carolina legislators that he really wouldn't use the U.S. military against South Carolina as long as they didn't do anything until after March the 4th of 1861. I don't really understand how he imagined the history books were going to remember him, even if that had been successful. The crisis had exploded during his administration, but for some reason, as long as the U.S. Army still controls everything on March the 4th of 1861, it's not his problem. The problem is, of course, that South Carolinians don't abide by this. When Anderson relocates to Sumter, the South Carolinians immediately take command of the forts that he has just abandoned. And they begin planning. They begin fixing the gun ports as much as possible, targeting the guns now against Fort Sumter instead of out to sea like they'd originally been intended. So when the Lincoln administration takes office in March of 1861, they're of course confronted with this massive problem. In the intervening months between December and March, food supplies in Fort Sumter are beginning to dwindle. The men are going hungry. Of course, the Charlestonians are not exactly sending food or supplies to Fort Sumter. They want those men out. Confederate authorities are pushing that there needs to be a peaceful resolution to this. Nobody really wants to be the first one to fire a gun. Everyone is hoping that this can be resolved in some way through diplomatic means. But the South Carolinians begin to get antsy. Lincoln decides to ask his cabinet their opinions on what should be done regarding resupply. So this is a letter that Lincoln writes on March the 15th. So this is 11 days after he's taken office. And he's asking the Attorney General, assuming it to be possible to now provision Fort Sumter under all the circumstances, is it wise to attempt it? Question mark. Please give me your opinion in writing on this question. Your obedient servant, A. Lincoln. So Lincoln sent copies of this letter to each one of his cabinet members. The reason that the handwriting for the most part doesn't look like Lincoln's is because it was written by his secretary. But Lincoln himself did sign this. That is very much the A. Lincoln signature underneath. So this is the original letter that was sent to U.S. Attorney General Bates asking his opinion on whether or not Sumter should be resupplied. I don't know what just happened there, but I'm going to keep going, pretend like nothing did. The decision was made essentially to have a compromise. Some of Lincoln's cabinet wanted to reprovision the fort. Some of Lincoln's cabinet wanted to send reinforcements immediately. Others said that the fort should be abandoned entirely and that we should try to negotiate with South Carolina via diplomatic means. Lincoln decides essentially he's going to have a kind of a mix of all three. He sends word to the governor of South Carolina, informing him that he is sending a resupply vessel that will bring food to the men of Fort Sumter. And that as long as Fort Sumter is not attacked by the South Carolinians or Confederate authorities, that no attempt to land military troops will be made. He's literally he frames this almost today like we would call a humanitarian mission. These men are starving, and I'm simply trying to get food to them. Now, the South Carolinians, of course, are not happy with this. They go back and forth with the Confederate authorities about what should be done, but eventually it's decided that even before the resupply vessels can arrive, that they will attack Fort Sumter. This is the draft order for that resupply mission. This is actually a document that is written by Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, to Captain John Fonce of the Harriet Lane. And he informs him that the Harriet Lane, under your command, having been detached from the Collections District of New York and assigned to duty under the Navy Department, you are hereby instructed to pursue to Charleston within 10 miles due east from off of Charleston's lighthouse. There you will wait for the captain of the Powhatan, which was one of the strongest U.S. Navy warships we had at that time. It was believed there had already been one attempt under the Buchanan administration. I will give him credit for that. There was one attempt to send reinforcements to Sumter. That's the Star of the West incident. And as soon as the Star of the West tried to enter the harbor at Charleston, it was fired upon by the South Carolinians. So when Lincoln decides to send the Harriet Lane down to send food to hungry men, he says, we're going to send a U.S. warship with you. That way, if you come under fire during this mission, we will be able to return fire. The Star of the West had no armaments on it, or at least nothing that could hit the Charlestonian positions. So this is the draft order by Wells to Captain Fonce. Now, unfortunately for Captain Fonce, when he would arrive off of Charleston, he would find the Powhatan, but he would actually arrive during the day of the 12th, and the attack on Sumter is already commenced. There's nothing they can do. They literally have a front row seat to watch what the South Carolinians will do to Major Robert Anderson and his bevy of men. So this is a map of Charleston Harbor. Here is Fort Sumter, literally at the opening of the channel. You can see they actually have the ranges of how far the guns can reach. You've got an effective range of 8,100 yards, an effective range of 8,500 yards, and so on and so forth. So they knew how far the guns would go. We don't have it in our collection, but the Library of Congress actually has a phenomenal hand-drawn map from the opposite perspective of this. This is the U.S. military's perspective of what Fort Sumter could potentially do under U.S. control. Library of Congress actually has General Beauregard's map that shows all of the incoming artillery fire from all of the different military positions that he occupied, with all of the ranges of what guns would be able to reach Sumter and which guns would not. Their attack, which begins in the early morning hours of April the 12th, will last about 34 hours, so a day and a half, essentially. It has been estimated that during the course of that 34-hour battle, South Carolina / Confederate authorities fire somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 artillery rounds at Fort Sumter. Now, they are using a combination of solid steel cannonballs, which simply rely on kinetic energy to punch holes in masonry forts or wooden structures or whatever it happens to hit, maybe even human tissue. But they're also using what's called hot shot. So you take one of those solid steel cannonballs and you set it in a furnace and you let it heat up to about 700 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you roll it down the barrel of the gun and you've got your powder charge already sitting there. And when that hot cannonball hits the powder charge, it ignites automatically. And it fires what today we would call an incendiary round. So when those rounds hit wooden structures, fires begin to ignite. Now, Anderson knew that not only was he outgunned and outmanned, but the weapons that he had at his disposal, were never going to be able to counter what the Confederates could bring to bear against him. So he sends all of his men down to the lower casemates of the fort, which are the most heavily defended. He wants to make sure that none of his men are going to suffer during this battle. He's going to try to keep them safe as possible. There is a story that has never been able to be confirmed, but Major Ulysses Doubleday later wrote in his biography that he was so angry at Anderson that he was not allowing Sumter essentially to fight back, that at some point during the battle, Doubleday sneaks out of the lowest casemates. So the guns that they had been able to emplace and range out to where they should be fired at their Confederate opponents, they had already loaded the guns, they were set and ready to be fired. And Doubleday claims in his biography that he literally just walked down the line and yanked the lanyard of each gun, firing a single round out of the gun because he was going to make sure that Sumter at least hit back at the Confederates in some way. We have no way to prove that, but I do like to imagine this very angry military officer kind of gingerly walking along and firing a cannon every few moments. He was going to give him something back. He wasn't going to let him get away completely empty-handed. After that 34 hours, the combination of kinetic rounds and hot shot had taken its toll on the fort. Not only had there been massive holes punched inside the fort, but all of the military structures, including the barracks and things of that nature, were on fire. And Anderson realized that his men were going to succumb to that fire if he did not do something immediately. So Robert Anderson does the only thing he has at his disposal. He surrenders. Now, the surrender has to be the most magnanimous in U.S. military history. Robert Anderson and his men are allowed to march out of Fort Sumter with their baggage and weapons intact. They are allowed to fire a 100-gun salute in honor of the American flag. They are allowed to board transport vessels that will take them anywhere in the world that they desire to go. Nobody is arrested as a war criminal. Nobody is placed in POW camps. Nobody has their gear confiscated. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The overarching one, of course, is that the South Carolinians, like many people in this era, believed that this was essentially going to be a one-and-done war. That whoever won the Battle of Fort Sumter, if it be the South, then the South would become an independent nation, and if it be the North, we would remain unified. Now that this one-and-done battle was over, and South Carolina had won, they kind of knew that, you know, we're probably going to want to trade with those Northerners at some point, and we really don't need to rub their nose in our victory. Maybe we should just let them guys go, and let's make sure we get off on the right foot with our two new independent nations of South Carolina and the United States. The other reason I think that they were so incredibly magnanimous, and most people don't know this, is that the commanding officer of the Confederate forces in Charleston was a man by the name of Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard. Beauregard knew Robert Anderson. They had been friends at West Point. In fact, when Beauregard was a cadet there, Anderson was one of the artillery instructors. And Beauregard ended up spending a full extra year at West Point, where he was learning artillery tactics and strategy from Robert Anderson. I think that he had no desire to embarrass his friend. He had made his point. He had won the battle. And there was no reason to rub Anderson's nose in this. So they're firing the 100-gun salute. And unfortunately, on the 47th round, there is a misfire. And as they're firing it, the man who's loading the gun goes off unexpectedly and kills the man that's loading it, severely injures another man who will later die from his wounds. Those are the only two casualties from the Battle of Fort Sumter. If we hadn't fired the gun salute, there wouldn't have been a single casualty during the battle. So, Robert Anderson and his men leave. They board transport vessels that take them back north. Robert Anderson is welcomed in the North as a hero for the sacrifices that he and his command had to make during the battle. The South Carolinians cheer because they've won this great victory against the United States, and they believe that they are now going to be an independent nation. Unfortunately for them, it's not going to work out that way. So now we're going to jump ahead. So after the bombardment, after the evacuation, Confederate authorities move about putting the fort back into commission. They send a working party of over 100 slaves to Fort Sumter who are trying to rebuild the casemates. Where the damage is too heavy, they begin to pack sand into the holes and things of that nature. They're going to put Sumter back into fighting function, because the Charlestonians think that they realize pretty quickly that the battle is not over, the war is not over, and there's probably a good chance that the United States Navy will come calling at some point in the future. In the immediate aftermath of this attack, President Lincoln orders a naval blockade of the southern ports. April the 19th of 1861, he issues a proclamation informing all of the southern states that the U.S. Navy would begin blockading the ports. And then over the course of the next several years, you have various attacks by U.S. naval personnel. You also have landings by the U.S. military. In April of 1863, the U.S. Navy begins the bombardment of Sumter and other fortifications in Charleston Harbor. Now, what you have here is a telegram from President Lincoln to his wife. It's dated August the 29th of 1863. I'll go ahead and get it out here. And it says, Mrs. A. Lincoln, Manchester, New Hampshire. All quite well. Fort Sumter is certainly battered down and utterly useless to the enemy, and it is believed here, but not entirely certain, that both Sumter and Fort Wagner are occupied by our forces. It is also certain that General Gillmore has thrown some shot into the city of Charleston. Signed, A. Lincoln. Kind of a funny thing to write your wife, right? Good news, honey. We attacked several forts. We think we've taken them. But Lincoln was always sharing this type of information with his wife. He was always very proud of the accomplishments that the U.S. military had been able to gain. Still, though, kind of cracks me up that he writes it that way. And even as President of the United States, he is not entirely sure of what's going on. He's getting rumors, he's getting reports, but nobody has officially told him yet that the U.S. flag is being raised over Fort Sumter. Now, unfortunately, the fighting that will occur in 1861, and of course the subsequent battles that will occur in the two intervening years, leaves Fort Sumter an absolute wreck. This is a drawing of what Sumter looked like in the afternoon of November 1863. You can still see the Confederate flag flying over the fort. You can make out some of the casemates on the inside. That's what these kind of circle, half moon appearances are. But the fort it essentially doesn't exist by November of 1863. It has been battered so heavily and so often, and the Confederates are not in a position either to repair it, and they do not have the funds to raise it and try to rebuild it. So it's just kind of become a muted island in the middle of Charleston Harbor. But it still very proudly flies their flag. So they would hold on. The president is unfortunately wrong in his telegram here about us having Fort Sumter in 1863. The South Carolinians would maintain control of it until early February of 1865, when General William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia and eventually marched through the Carolinas forced the Charlestonians to finally abandon Fort Sumter for good. The U.S. Army officially reoccupied the fort on February the 22nd of 1865. That's when we moved in and raised the American flag again over Sumter, or what was left of it. After we reoccupy Fort Sumter, the decision is made that we should have a celebration. They know that the anniversary is not far off after we've occupied it in February of 1865. And so there's going to be a massive celebration and a ceremony on the 4th anniversary of the fall of Fort Sumter to celebrate it. Now, this is kind of hard to read because President Lincoln wrote this in pencil instead of in pen like he typically did. But this is actually a letter that Lincoln sends from City Point, Virginia on March the 27th of 1865 at 3:35 in the afternoon. And he's sending it to the Secretary of War. And what always cracks me up about this letter is they are arguing about when did Sumter actually fall. Nobody can remember after 4 years of fighting. And so Lincoln literally writes, I feel quite confident that Sumter fell on the 13th and not on the 14th of April, as you have it. Look up the old almanac and other data and see if I am not right. So they're trying to decide when should this celebration, when should this ceremony actually take place? When is the day that the fort actually falls? Ironically, Lincoln himself would be invited to attend this ceremony. Now, he would decide that not only were there too many pressing concerns in Washington, D.C., but there was also a play he wanted to see at Ford's Theater. So rather than going to the events in Charleston, he would stay in Washington, D.C. Of course, we all know what happens on April the 14th and then later on April the 15th of 1865, but he, in theory, would have still been in Charleston, or at the very least would have been making his way back on April the 14th. Finally, I'm going to conclude. These are some photographs. These are from our collection, and they're taken from inside of Fort Sumter after several of the heavy battles. And it gives you an idea of the amount of damage. These are the officers' quarters, but I don't know if you can see, fire has ravaged the interior. All of the windows are all burned out. These are the casemates that were actually facing Fort Moultrie. There's virtually nothing left from the inside of the fort. This is, again, those kind of half moon, half circle that I pointed out in the earlier drawing. The fort is an abandoned wreck. You can even see artillery pieces, artillery rounds stacked and waiting to be loaded into guns, waiting to be fired. These are two African Americans standing atop one of the furnaces inside of the fort. After the war, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came in. They did a lot of work on the fort. They would never return it to what it was in 1860 or what it had intended to be in 1861. For a number of years, it would be used as a beacon point in Charleston Harbor. It would be used as an unmanned lighthouse position. And finally, in the 20th century, the National Park Service took it over and it was turned into the national park that we know today. So of course, today you can go and visit Fort Sumter. You go basically to where Fort Moultrie is and you get on a boat and they take you out there to Sumter. And they always warn you that make sure you're on the last boat out at 5 o'clock, because that's when all of the guides leave Sumter. And if you're out there, you're probably going to be out there until the next day. And there's not a lot of places to sleep at Fort Sumter right now. So it always cracks me up how often they reiterate to you that you really need to make sure you're on the last boat out of Sumter. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, either about the battle, about any of the artifacts that I've shown you today, or about the Cardinal game yesterday. So,
If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic around to you.
See, this is
right
like
there.
school. Nobody wants to be the first one to ask a question.
Probably don't need the mic, but where were Beauregard and his troops when they were firing on Anderson in Fort Sumter? Were they on another vessel or on?
No. So here, I'll tell you what. Let me
Okay.
back this up. So they are occupying Fort Moultrie. They are occupying Castle Pinckney. They are occupying what was left of Fort Johnson, Fort Wagner. All of these a number of these, this is actually an 1863 battle map. So several of these forts are showing U.S. military installations that have been constructed once the U.S. Army begins landings. But they are hitting it from all sides from land-based artillery positions. The Confederates don't have much in the way of a navy in early 1861. So they were much more adept at being able to hit it with land-based heavy artillery. And that's why, as I described before, Library of Congress has it. And if the Library of Congress is listening and they're bored with that map and they want to get rid of it, we would happily accept it here. It's a hand-colored, hand-drawn map from 1861 that shows all of the different Confederate positions. And then again, it's got lines drawn from each one of them with the range of how far the distance is, so that they knew what guns to fire and what guns not to. Because not every single fort had the same guns spread throughout. You would have smaller caliber weapons for close-in fire. You would have longer range, heavier weapons for distant fire. And if you're not going to hit Sumter with a small caliber weapon, there's no reason to even use it. So they had made very clear, they were very intelligent when it came to this. They made it very clear that only the guns that would actually reach Sumter were the ones that were to be fired. And in some cases, they were simply mortars that are firing on a high arc trajectory rather than direct fire.
Any other questions? Right over here.
Hi, thank you very much. I have two questions. One is, can you talk about the new museum that is now opening right there, that is connected to the Charleston Harbor? And then the other one is, we're now reading in contemporary stuff about what is the definition of insurrection. And one of the people who was a focus of this at this period of time was someone who released U.S. military material to the South. And so the question is whether any of that insurrectionally given military equipment was involved in these actions around Fort Sumter.
So, in the final months of the Buchanan administration, Buchanan had a number of cabinet members who were Southerners by birth. His Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, was a Virginian. His Secretary of the Treasury was a Georgian. His Secretary of the Interior was a North Carolinian. And there is evidence that all of those men, in the last months of their time in the Buchanan administration, were positioning the South to be in the most advantageous position possible. When it comes to Secretary of War Floyd, it's known that he shipped I believe it was 25,000 weapons, 125,000 guns to various Southern arsenals. He was ordering that heavy artillery from the Allegheny, Pennsylvania arsenal be moved to various forts in the South. There were also lower level functionaries within the government who had been born in the South and had every intention of making sure that their future country would be set up. Assistant Secretary of State Trescott, who was a South Carolinian by birth, was the main go-between between South Carolina officials and the governor of South Carolina, or South Carolina officials and U.S. government officials. All of these men, I was pretty hard on Buchanan earlier. All of these men are telling James Buchanan, don't do anything. This will all get resolved diplomatically. They're not telling him that the South is going to secede and become an independent nation. There's a lot of thought that what the South is doing is just simply bluster, that for more than 30 years, every time the South doesn't get something the way it wants, it threatens to secede, and then everyone bends over backwards to try to appease it. And there were a lot of hardcore Republicans who were saying, no, we are not going to appease them this time. We are not going to bend over backwards for them. So Buchanan is getting bad advice. He's got people who are working underneath him who are taking away things from the U.S. military, taking away things from the U.S. Treasury. It was claimed, actually, that the Secretary of the Treasury had tried to purposely spend everything in the Treasury before he left so that the U.S. government would be left destitute under the Lincoln administration. So there is a lot of that kind of activities going on in the background. As far as the new museum, I don't know that I can comment on it. I have no connection at this time to the new museum. Sumter has a beautiful museum inside of the fort. I've been there. I would highly recommend visiting it. They've got the flag that flew over Sumter. They've got a number of original pieces. We have worked with Fort Sumter in the past. Back in 2008, when we did our exhibit on Team of Rivals, Sumter sent us a small section of wall. It was about 24 bricks that were still held together by mortar. They sent us a 12-inch mortar round. They sent us a number of things that we put on display that were very well received by the crowds here. So if they're building a new museum, maybe that gives me an excuse to convince my wife I need to go to Charleston again. They got really good food there. The whole city's a historic site. I like to forget what they did in 1861 and just kind of enjoy it now.
Frank is enjoying watching from Idaho, appreciates the program, and Shirley asks,
potatoes.
Shirley asks, what happened to Captain Anderson and his men? Did they fight in the war?
They did. Most of Anderson's men will go on to serve in the U.S. military during the war in various commands and capacities. Anderson is pretty heavily stressed by what has occurred. He retains his rank, but he is initially sent home for a while, basically to rest and recuperate from everything that had happened. He is later promoted up through the ranks. He will eventually receive the rank of, I believe it was brigadier general. I don't think he made major general. But he would eventually be commissioned a general in the Union Army. And he would retain the status of being the hero of Fort Sumter throughout the remainder of his life, even though he commanded it for a little over 34 hours during an attack. So technically 4 months he commanded it, but no, most of the men actually did go on to continue to serve in the military.
Good. Any other questions here from the audience? Right here.
When you said they had to build up ground for the fort, I was kind of picturing Ellis Island or Castle Clinton in New York, but then you showed the drawing and it looked very substantial. That would take quite a while to put together, wouldn't it?
That's part of the reason why the construction of the fort dragged on for 30 years.
But it really is as massive as that drawing looked?
You want to go back to the first one, I think, is the kind of color drawing?
No, toward the end when you were showing the ruins.
Sir, I think I remember, I was just there in October and I'll talk to you, but I think they brought it down from, like it's granite from New England.
Yeah, they brought 70,000 tons of granite.
You're talking hard rock.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they dump
No,
it.
it was not sandstone.
No, they bring 70,000 tons of granite from Maine, I think.
Maine, yeah, that sounds right.
And dump it on top of the sandbar. The engineers had gone and had done hydrological sounds and had thought that the sandbar would be sufficient, but with hurricanes and changing storms and rising tides, they realized that you needed a much firmer base. I tried to only use images from our collection so that you'd be able to see the real things, but the Library of Congress has the actual drawings that were done by the Corps of Engineers for what the fort would look like, and they've got the drawings of what it would look like below water level, where they were designing the structural emplacements that would need to be put in place before the fort itself could be built.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending Tales from the Vault today, a collaboration between the Illinois State Museum and the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. In just a moment, we'll give you a chance to come up and see the objects up close. Just don't reach over the stanchions, please, and we'll be sure to show them up close to you. In the meantime, thank you for coming once again, and please give your appreciation to Dr. Ian Hunt for the presentation. Thank you.